I guess we should start with introductions. So it'd be good to hear a bit about what your job role is and kind of briefly what you do at Grendon. And also Dean and I will do the same thing. So Dean, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so my name's Dean Kelland. I'm the artist in residence at HMP Grendon at the moment. And I guess my role is to kind of work with some of the residents in developing their creative practice. And I guess it's twofold really. So that's kind of the first part of my role. The second part of my role is to actually make my own artwork about or in relation to the experiences that I have at Grendon, but also what I'm kind of very keen on is producing artwork that speaks to and for some of the men's experiences as well. Yeah, does that sound okay, James?
That sounds perfect. Yeah, a very good introduction, I guess. And you also work at the University of Wolverhampton as well.
I do, yeah. So I run 2 MA courses at the University of Wolverhampton, and yeah, that keeps me busy. That keeps me very busy.
And Richard, would you like to go next?
My name is Richard Shuker, and I lead the therapeutic service at HMP Grendon. We'll probably say a bit more about that later on, I'm sure, but Grendon is made up of 6 separate therapeutic communities, all involve different psychological modalities and approaches. So my job is the overall lead of the therapeutic service here, including research as well. And I've been in my post for about 7 years now. I've been at Grendon a bit longer than that.
And Jo, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so my role, which I officially moved into just over 2 years ago, is the DTC lead of core creative therapies at Grendon. So that incorporates music therapy, psychodrama, and art therapy. So my role really is to oversee, all of the service in that respect, and the running of the groups and the supervision of staff and the management of the team and the way forward really in terms of how we work across the TCs. And obviously I run two groups as well. I run a group on the induction unit, and which is a kind of experiential group, and I run a weekly group on Sea-Wing community as well. And I have quite a big role in staff supervision and reflective practice.
Yeah, and you're actually our supervisor as well, it's worth saying, I suppose, for
yeah.
the residency. But yeah, and just say I'm James the Tunji Cobill. I'm the producer for the project, so, which means in very short terms that I manage the artist residency at Grendon. Dean, we should probably contextualise the talk.
Yes.
And I wanted to say to start with that we aren't actually going to introduce the residency too much. I think what you've said already is probably as far as we'll go into it. But there are other talks online. I think we talked for an hour actually between the two of us about the residency at length, and that's available on Ikon's website and on our YouTube channel. So if anybody is interested in that, then look towards a different online talk, I suppose is what I'm saying. But yeah, the motivation for this talk really is your research, Dean. You aren't a psychologist, but rather in a way an observer of Grendon's psychological practices, which are informing your residency. And I'd say that observation takes place in your interaction with the residents, I suppose, particularly in the studio, which we could talk about later, I suppose. So can you start by telling us a bit about your research and how it fits into Grendon?
Yeah, so and I think this will probably lead on to the first question for Richard and Jo as well. So I'm really interested in representations of masculinity. I have an interdisciplinary practice, but probably with an emphasis on performative processes. and making performance works. And I guess the things I'm really interested in are the way in which cycles of failure and kind of cyclical patterns of masculinity are played out. I'm really interested in how they're played out in popular culture, and I did a significant body of work around masculinities in sitcoms, and I'm also really interested in kind of the relationship. It sounds a little bit of a cliche, really, but it's the relationship between the kind of tragic male figure in comedy. And so from that, I've kind of developed an interest in kind of what's now being kind of popularly termed as toxic masculinity, and how that fits into kind of a cyclical pattern. And I guess overall, I'd kind of use the term, or what I'm interested in most is kind of flawed masculinities and the way those patterns kind of contribute to flawed maleness, really. And I guess, and this would be my kind of first question for Richard and Joe. You know, one of the things that I've kind of looked at is kind of historical patterns of masculine representation and masculine behaviours, and those obviously shift and change over time. So I guess one of the things that I'd be kind of interested in asking first is how has the approach to rehabilitation changed at Grendon over the years? I know, Richard, you said you'd been there for quite a while, and Joe, I think you've been at Grendon quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Have you kind of, could you talk about how rehabilitation has perhaps changed at Grendon?
I think change that I see is, so I think the thrust of what we do remain the same, I think, Dean. Mm-hmm. I think the idea on building relationships, establishing safety, the idea of allowing people to be genuine and authentic in their relationships is very important, and allow people to have a real sense of ownership and responsibility for their communities for which they are accountable. I think these components have remained the same for maybe since the onset in 1962, although to make it clear, I haven't been here since 1962, just to make that clear. Joe may have another view on this. I think we have become more aware that the therapeutic process, as powerful as it is, needs to be enhanced and augmented by connections we make with the external world, whether it's your service, whether it's universities, whether it's outside charities, whether it's support people need post-Grendon. I think we're conscious that whilst we provide an opportunity for people to make some significant personal and psychological changes, we do need to emphasize the importance of connections with, relationships with the outside world, and not become too insular. That would be my first thought. Mm-hmm. I think, Joe, our combined time at Grendon is probably coming up to 40. Is it 40 years for our combined time together? Mm-hmm. So you have a strong sense of any changes also that you may have seen or not seen over the years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, you know, we can't, I think perhaps historically we might have been maybe a little bit more in a bubble at Grendon, in terms of thinking that once people go out the door, that's it, they're kind of ready to go. But actually, I think there has been much more investment over the last, well, certainly within the last 10 years, perhaps between 5 and 10 years, for you know, to get more external agencies involved, and to think more about the reality that the residents need so much more support with you know, surviving the outside world. And it's a big step to come out of Grendon and then just expect people to manage. I think think that feels like we've invested more, and I think we've been criticised for that along the way as well, with some of the audits and things perhaps, and asked to think about that a little bit more. And I think we have thought about it a lot more, actually. That would be my sense of it. And
do you think that the practices at Grendon differ significantly from other prisons in the UK and beyond, actually? You know, how James and I often, when we talk about Grendon, we kind of say it's a special place and it's a special experience. How different is it to other prisons?
Do you want to go first?
Well, I suppose I would just say it's quite different, really. I suppose if you think about what we're asking the men to engage in, you know, living on a community, being responsible for one another in the way they do, and of course engaging in quite intense group psychotherapy. I suppose it's going to open up a lot of vulnerability, but also toxicity, which I think we have to manage as well. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of toxicity in prisons anyhow, but because of the nature of what we're working with and the trauma and the damage and the vulnerability and obviously the offending behaviours. So we're not immune to that at Grendon. Obviously the way that the men cope with themselves and their offending behaviour patterns, they don't go away, but I suppose they manifest themselves in different ways. So I suppose on one hand I'd say it's very different, because what we're asking them to do is actually take quite big risks in forming attachments and being intimate with one another. But that comes at a cost, because we have to deal with the fallout of that, and you know, some of that's positive and some of that is more difficult to manage. So I suppose that's a very different ask to containing somebody in a, I've never worked in a mainstream prison, but what I imagine is containing someone in a mainstream prison and not really opening those doors.
My experience in Grendon, I spent 4 or 5 years working in another sort of fairly high secure, well, it was a high secure prison for male offenders before I came here. And one thing I noticed about Grendon was the level of interest and support shown between residents to other residents and residents to staff, and a real sense of people working together in a very collaborative sort of way. And I noticed that was a really striking difference to the prison where there'd been is a mutual antagonisms and sort of hostility. And I've always been interested in what is it that leads people to want to be able to work together to get on with each other. And I suppose to answer your question, Dean, I think one of the big differences here is that we give our residents responsibility for the decisions they take. More importantly, they are accountable that they take.
Yeah.
We give people not just a tokenistic, I don't think, but a really meaningful sense of ownership and involvement in their own communities. Making decisions for making decisions about their own and each other's treatment, and they are also accountable for what they do and accountable for their behaviour. I think that's fairly different. And that's other high secure prisons.
Okay, that's great. I mean, one of the other things I kind of wanted to ask is, when I kind of tell people that I'm artist in residence at a prison, there's an immediate kind of leap in the mind of the person that I'm talking to that I'm in some way engaged in art therapy, which of course I'm not, or I'm not formally involved in that as a practice. And I just wanted to ask, how does creative practice, and I know, Joe, you mentioned art therapy and psychodrama and music therapy as kind of things that augment the experience at Grendon for the residents. How important is that? And I guess for the people who are kind of watching this, how would you kind of differentiate those practices, and kind of, I guess, what would you expect from the residents in terms of what they produce as a result of engaging with those practices?
Mm-hmm. So obviously they're all different modalities. So in terms of what we would expect, you know, our groups, the way we work with them is very much in parallel with their small group work. So obviously they work as a small group 3 times a week. So that becomes quite an intimate and their kind of primary group space, I suppose. And then we work alongside their small group as an additional group. But obviously our groups are comprised of different members from different groups. So it's an opportunity for them to be in another group and to see other people from a different angle in other parts of the community. So in that way in itself, it's quite helpful. I think what I suppose we work with is, you know, which is similar to your work, obviously in the creative world, is there's quite a lot of unconscious processes that can be taking place quite naturally in all of the modalities that kind of in a nice way catches the men off guard a bit. And they don't have as much control over that because, you know, the verbal language, we're quite good at being quite in control. It's quite a conscious language. And I think what in terms of what we expect is for some of those processes to start to happen in those groups. And for the men to then see a very different or see things from a slightly different angle. And for some to be able to connect with things that perhaps haven't been connected with in the verbal language. Mm-hmm. So it's a different way to reach parts that I think classically are can be quite difficult areas of their therapy or of their lives. And it can happen quite naturally without, you know, a great deal of coercing from the groups. That's how the modalities work quite naturally. So I suppose what I'm saying as a facilitator is that the group, you know, the group cohesion is, and the trust and so on is very important, as it is in all the groups. But that process will enable something quite important. And then what obviously we expect is that those members of the group are regularly feeding back and sharing that work into their other groups so that we're a bridge, you know, we're connected and there isn't any separation mm-hmm. of the work, if that helps answer your question. I mean, I can talk more specifically about the modalities, but I mean, because they all kind of work in different ways, obviously. So like with art therapy, we wouldn't be expecting someone to create beautiful artwork, you know, we would be expecting someone to think about, you know, what are my risk factors? What have I come to this group for? What would be a useful thing for me to explore with the art materials today? And quite often they don't know when they get into the room, but then, you know, by just sitting down with some materials, something will inevitably emerge.
It's really interesting because a number of the residents have kind of come to me and shown me something they've done in art therapy, but they see it there's a very clear definition where they won't then suggest to me, could I take this further and turn it into a piece of artwork with you? They very clearly see the difference between exploring something in art therapy with you and then kind of making a piece of artwork in conversation with me. So I think that's a really interesting thing, that the residents themselves see that definition. Yeah. Richard, Could I just ask, because before we started recording, you said how important the kind of creative opportunities are to enhance the experience and add to the experience of the residents. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, you know, where you see it in terms of, I guess, how creative practice can contribute to the residents' experience at Grendon.
I think there's a number of ways. I think, Dean, I think I've always been impressed by how much absolute talent our residents have in many different ways, many different spheres of life, and some of the abilities and skills they have, which haven't really been sort of realised before at Grendon, to come out, whether or not it's, you know, sharing a wing meter, sorting out conflicts, or whether or not it's somebody with a real skill for art or drama or music. And I think these things are massively important. They're massively important in, well, helping people to develop a sense of meaning and purpose. And these things are often missing in the lives of our residents before they come here. So what I've observed is that the sense of meaning and purpose derived from being in therapy, being in the community, but also the artwork and creative work is hugely important. I think it also helps define people as somebody as people in a way that they believe they have something to give other than just being an offender. So the sense of pride people take in what they've been able to achieve is also important. I also think it's helpful for people because in connecting with art, they also connect with other people, they connect with the outside world. So they see themselves as having a sense of belonging and a sense of connection with people like yourself, with universities, with other academic bodies, with charities. And I suppose one thing that our residents have often sensed is the disconnection between their own world's experience and another way of being. The way they have achieved their goals to be through, you know, crime and offending, being able to achieve goals of meaning and purpose through connecting with art and yourselves and you know, others with an interest in the prison. I think it shapes how they view themselves. It shapes their own narrative. It shapes how they understand how they can connect with others. So for all those reasons that I see. I see what you do. I see connections with other external, bodies as hugely important parts of people's change and development.
Mm-hmm. Great. I mean, you both actually touched upon two things that I wanted to ask about. So, as I mentioned at the top, I work in an art school at Wolverhampton, and we're very much a very traditional art school, and so everything is kind of contained within the one space. And one of the things that I kind of was struck by is, whilst of course they're very, very different environments, there are a couple of kind of, I guess, pillars of activity that kind of I felt familiar with when I first kind of settling in at Grendon. You know, in the art school, as part of the students' experience, they work in small groups. They talk about their work, how they're developing it, and often that will bring in external factors. Well, they talk about things that are happening externally and how that's feeding into their artwork. So there's kind of the small group work, but then the school itself has a series of communities that are identified by the type of work that they make. But we're very kind of keen to establish a broader community where there is interaction between those different disciplines. And I was kind of struck when I got to Grendon that maybe it was my own kind of apprehension, but when I arrived there, I thought, oh, I wonder how long it will take me to kind of get used to the way things are at Grendon. And actually I was really kind of comforted to spot those things, the small group work and the kind of the communities. I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit. I know that the notion of community is very important for the residents, and you've talked obviously about the group work. I just wondered how you could kind of, if you could just kind of illuminate that a little bit more for people watching the interview, so they understand, you know, how important community is in the process for the residents.
I think it's a really interesting question. For me, it's always been really interesting how people with significant antisocial histories want to come into a prison where they're actively involved in their own imprisonment. So they're actively involved in their own lives in prison, making decisions. They want to make it work. So it's always important. It gives people a sense of support and shared identity. It's a sense of being connected with a family where there is some reliability and safety, and these things have often been very missing in people's lives. I think the idea of being able to create a culture where people have a shared set of values and goals together is massively important. So if you think about it, the goals that our residents have and our staff have are generally the same. They are to make prison meaningful, they are to create safety, and also to lead to reduction and reconviction and make the prison a place where relationships are positive. And those goals, those values are equally important for staff and residents. I suppose that the challenge is, how do we get people to, you know, form that shared identity and those shared goals, and how do we get people to work alongside each other? And doing that as part of a community where everybody has a clear shared involvement in what happens is really important. Now that's my sense of things, and I think it's always surprised me. Also, finally, it's always surprised me how people who come into Grendon, residents come into Grendon, very quickly get into the idea of working alongside other prisoners, being involved in making decisions, involved in sorting out conflicts, being open about their own behaviour and struggles. So these things are you know, clearly, you know, really important for Grendon and sort of our, you know, sort of our ethos.
Mm-hmm. And Jo, whenever I think about kind of community and the ideal community, it's one of those things that on paper is kind of wonderful, but inevitably hierarchies form. How are those kind of managed at Grendon in terms of the kind of broader communities?
I mean, I think we are quite, I suppose when it comes to allocations of residents across communities, we start there in terms of thinking about, you know, getting that spectrum of offending, and that carries on then into the small group selection. So they're trying again to blend and to get a mixture. I mean, we're quite conscious, for example, to have some residents who have committed sexual offences onto the main communities as well, so that there isn't that divide. And I think that we've struggled with some of that, because I think that the hierarchies do exist, and I think residents who've committed sexual offences are still quite low on the pecking order. You know, I think they lend themselves to some of these more difficult projections that other residents feel about themselves and their own histories, and that plays out in the group work. So I think, though, you know, I don't think we'll ever eradicate the hierarchies. It's part of a natural defense mechanism for human beings, isn't it? And you certainly see it in the group work and in the community, the large community meetings. You know, you certainly see that being enacted, and it's difficult to challenge, but it's very important that the staff and the residents are able to talk about that and to challenge it. But that, you know, it is difficult to do at times. So I think as an organisation, we are quite sensitive to the hierarchical situation or reality, and it kind of, you know, ebbs and flows, and we're quite sensitive to, you know, it plays out through ethnicity groups, because we have quite predominantly white residents as well. So I think there's an area there that we need to be, you know, to keep on being mindful of, and whether that's the situation of where the prison is, but you know, I think those hierarchies can play out in that respect as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question. But
I think it's really interesting because James and I have both kind of experienced a sense of those hierarchies, and we've tried ourselves to be very sensitive to them as well. And I think the way we've always kind of approached working at Grendon is that I don't think we ask too many questions. We don't ask too much of the men, and if they want to talk to us about things, they'll talk to us about things, and that's okay, you know. But I don't think we've kind of gone. We've not kind of gone looking for any of those things, and I think on those times where we've done like kind of group workshops and we've just been suddenly aware of the dynamics in the space. And
who's talking to who, Dean, for instance?
Yeah. And how that's kind of managed, I guess you see it as a kind of microcosm really when you've got a small group doing a workshop. It kind of focuses things a little bit. But I think you're kind of, I think the word sensitivity is a really important one, because I think everybody at Grendon is sensitive to that and manages it as best as possible, really. And I think it's a really interesting thing. I think when you kind of consider communities, and of course, you know, everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others, kind of thing. And you know,
and I don't think it is always managed that well. I mean, I think there's a real invitation to collude with some of that hierarchical behaviour, and I think there's a real invitation to collude from staff as well. So I don't think my view is that I don't think it is always well managed. And I think, you know, sometimes we have to have those challenging conversations as a staff team. You know, what are we being drawn into here? What are we frightened to confront? What, you know, because I guess what we're faced with is the offending behaviour and the aggression that you inevitably get when you confront some of this very blatant hierarchical behavior or attack, you know, an attack on someone's offence, for example. But years of being in groups, what I often see is it's very painful to look in the mirror, because what I think can happen is that, you know, when someone who happens to have an offence that's quite low on the pecking order presents something that reminds you of an aspect of yourself, that is quite often the time when that person can be attacked, because it becomes the projection, you know, it becomes too uncomfortable to even imagine that you might have something in common with that individual.
Right.
And I think, for example, I think there's a lot of shame about domestic violence in Grendon, and of course a lot of the residents will not have that on their record. They won't have been convicted, but the way that they've managed themselves in relationships of intimacy has been utterly shameful, and it's very deeply hidden. So when you have someone in a group who perhaps has an offence of a sexual nature, or any form of violence against a partner or a woman, for example, or even a male partner, that can really trigger some very uncomfortable feelings for those individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so that's
I would agree with what Joe's saying. I think working on hierarchies and working on antagonisms that are there between offence, committed to different offences, it's always a work in progress, and I think there is a lot of shame held by people. I think one thing that we have, we know that we've realised that it does take time. We have to recognise it first. We have to recognise, people have to recognise and own the fact that they do often hold resentment towards others, whether it's people from different backgrounds, to staff, people committed sex offenders, acknowledging that they own these things, and people are struggle with that sometimes. I think we also know that when people can work together in a collaborative way, some of these hostilities and antagonisms do dissipate. I think it's very important that we don't just pretend that it's an easy thing to work through, because it isn't. I think a lot of our residents have been subject to significant early traumas and abuse, including physical and sexual violence. Being able to work through the feelings that they then carry towards others who have been abusers it requires the sensitivity, as Joe says. It requires time, and it requires people to feel they can express what they carry in a way that's respectful, but doesn't lead them to feel a sense of shame. And the relationships that we can build between residents is crucial in being able to overcome antagonism and hierarchy. But it's always a work in progress, something we always need to keep our eye on and not forget about.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you both for that. I mean, again, it's something you touched on earlier. Grendon seems to be quite unique in how active it is with external organisations. It does projects with charities, with sorry, lost my words. It does work with charities, universities, galleries like Ikon. How important is that to Grendon, and what do you think the overall benefit is for the residents?
I think if we get back to Grendon needing to, all organisations needing to work through a sense of being insular and connect with the outside world. So sort of insular in how you operate, needing to connect with the outside world. And that's a sign, I think, of a healthy organisation where we have scrutiny. We have people coming from different backgrounds. We lend ourselves open to the eye of the outside world, and that's really important. And as I think I said it earlier, that was what I was saying a few minutes ago. I think people establish a real sense of pride, in making the community safe and meaningful, but also a pride in their achievements, and also a pride in the relationships they can establish with the Ikon, with other charities at universities, and there's a sense of achievement and pride. That's my view on what's so important.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also mirrors society, doesn't it? It mirrors the kind of pro-social modelling of being in a community, a family, a community, a society. So it does prepare them to, you know, towards the sort of normality of society. So I think it kind of, for me, it mirrors that quite well. And you know, I guess some of these residents have not had opportunities before they came into prison in their lives to have connected societally, that's a word, and with and have an awareness of education, or, you know, creativity, or projects, you know, or these types of organizations that do exist, that kind of support, you know, and benefit, I suppose, our humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by I've been you know, privileged enough to be invited to some of the external events and to kind of witness those things, but also obviously James and I coordinated an exhibition for the men, and the one thing I was struck by, and actually I was you know, I shared with James my concern, because a number of the men that had kind of helped put that exhibition together and had kind of shown work and had kind of spent the day talking with our visitors to the exhibition were so elated the following day, you know, and they were saying to us, you know, can we do another one of these next month? Can we do more of these? And they were so, you know, so full of, I'll use Richard's words, they were so full of pride in what they'd achieved with that. And I did say to James, I said, I'm worried about the kind of come down from this, because we're not doing these so regularly, you know, they are kind of annual events. And, you know, it just made me feel a little bit concerned about, you know, what happens when they start to decompress from this experience that's been so kind of good for them. You know, does it mean they'll have a massive low? And I was kind of slightly kind of just worried about that, really. I could see obviously the huge benefit, but I just thought, oh, you know, like us all, when we experience something, you know, that's really positive for us, and then, you know, there is a kind of a recalibration from that. Is it something that's perhaps more, well, I guess where my concerns, you know, genuine, you know, were they?
I think it's a really important question and observation. One of the ways we look at our work is that in many ways, being in the community, you learn from your experiences. It's a living learning experience, and part of life that, yes, it's dealing with come downs and disappointments and the aftermath of having, let's say, a piece of work exhibited, and the come down after that, the aftermath of having your family visiting the prison for a whole day, spending a whole day with you, visiting your cell, and the aftermath of that, and dealing with come downs and disappointments and dejections and flatness is, yes, it's part of life. Yes, it happens here. Yes, I think people can generally learn that they can deal with that without, you know, resolving to, you know, the way they would deal with disappointments in their before prison. So, yeah, you're right. There is a sense of flatness, perhaps, that's more emphasised and more real and acute in prison. And I would say, yeah, we need to be aware of leaving people feeling like that. But I think, you know, I would say that generally the communities are, you know, supportive of each other after events like this, and do look out for each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like what I kind of call like a good depression.
So it's good that they've had that experience, and they, you know, and the part of dealing with that is the come down. Yeah, and it's better to have that experience than to not. Yeah,
I suppose that's quite a normal thing to go through, isn't it? We've seen it in other things as well, Dean. There was one resident who took part in a university-led debate, and this was somebody who wasn't known for speaking much at all, I think, but I think won the debate. and I think that same resident had also spoken so much at the event that we organised that he had a sore throat the next day, because he spent three hours speaking to, you know, a couple of people, I think.
Yeah.
So you know, I really can see the benefit of these kind of events, and you know, like you say, collaboration with other sectors and other organisations.
And I guess on a deeper level, they're really in touch with their shame, aren't they? Because for some, they don't feel that they deserve very much. They don't feel that they deserve to have people's attention in that way. I think they are in touch with their shame, and these kinds of experiences, and, you know, making contact with society that they've been locked away from, can bring about quite intense feelings. But I think that these are feelings that need to be recognised. That's my view, and kind of managed, and of course it's going to mirror how they cope when they are released, and they have to deal with those sorts of feelings. Because I mean, you know, they do. There is a, you know, they don't always talk about it that profoundly, but there is a lot of we work with a lot of shame.
And do those feelings dissipate? You know, if you go through the full course of therapy, the whole program for say 4 years at Grendon, do those feelings dissipate, you know, if somebody's then at the point where they move into kind of open conditions and Cat D?
Well, I think sorry, go on, Richard.
I was just going to say, I think not for everybody, but certainly for most people. Some people it's too much, it's too painful, it's too overwhelming. Other people carrying an awful lot of shame to do with what's happened to them as individuals, a real sense of shame. Talk about that and have some resolution to that. It seems really, really important for our residents, hugely important. If we ask people, you know, what drove you to want to come to therapy, they will often say it's to work through a sense of shame and a sense of acute chronic distress over what their experiences in life. So I would say, yeah, a lot of our men report when they leave Grendon, when the things that they learned was to get in touch with that shame and no longer to be sort of weighed down by it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I've only got a couple of questions left, really. One of them, James said to me, you'll be very brave to ask that one. You know, I'm going to go for it anyway. So why would a prison have an artist in residence, and what do you think what do you think an artist in residence can offer in a prison? And James thought I was brave, because if you said not a lot, really.
Well, I mean, I suppose my view is that quite a lot, really, because I think you're opening, you know, in terms of what we've talked about as well during this morning, you're really opening the residents' eyes to the you know, the value of creativity. You're developing confidence in those residents who have never really perhaps valued their own creativity or their talent. The connection between the world outside and, for example, the development of the relationship between Ikon and yourselves, I think is really, really important for all the reasons that we've kind of been talking about this morning, really. I think it's all related. You know, the idea of having some kind of gallery at Grendon, I think would be so valued by the residents. I think you coming in as a member of society outside, and practitioners coming in to work and engage with them on the wings, I think that's really important, really valued. I think it makes them feel valued.
I would also add that having you come here and the former artist in residence has been hugely important. People talk about it, officers talk about it, residents talk about it, and it also shapes our own understanding of ourselves and our role and our identity. as a prison that does embrace, creativity and create new ideas, new ways of seeing the world. So I think it's had an effect, because everybody talks about the work, and I think it's had an effect on how we see ourselves and our own self-identity as an establishment. So it's one of the things that I think adds a lot in terms of shaping our own understanding of ourselves as a prison.
I think in terms of, sorry, Dean. I think in terms of mentalising, also, it's a really important thing, because we work with personality disorders, and they are a classical group that struggle with mentalising, and kind of due to what they've experienced and how they function. And I think you cannot underestimate, in my view, the power of creativity when it comes to this particular client group, and the benefits of that for them in terms of their mental health. And any access that they have to that, I think, is incredibly important. And I know that not everyone accesses that or takes that up. But I think that, for me as a clinician, I think that's really, really, really important.
That's great. Thank you for that. I guess my final question.
Those are the good points. There's a lot more to add if you want to. I'll be running short of time. I guess we are.
Yeah, probably move. Yeah. I guess the last thing I kind of have to mention is the difficulties that we've all faced during the pandemic, and the effect that that's had. I mean, in terms of the residency, it's been very difficult to kind of, having built up a kind of relationship and a group of residents who were really engaged with kind of the things that we were doing. It's been difficult to kind of maintain that, really. I mean, one of the things that we've done, obviously, I write regularly to the men through the email A Prisoner. Joe has been amazing at managing the materials for us from a distance, which would previously have been something that would just, the system we'd got in place, we could just kind of keep that rolling for the residents. I had my first video call with our art rep on C Wing yesterday, which was just fantastic, to kind of talk again and talk through some of the things that he'd been making. He brought some of his work with him to show me, and it was great to have that. And I obviously want to do more of that, hoping that, of course, it won't be too long before we can be back. But how has, I mean, we've talked a lot about kind of the things that happen at Grendon and its uniqueness, and some of the things that are in place in terms of communities and group work. What have the difficulties been, really, from the pandemic, and how have you dealt with that?
I think they've been substantial. I think trying to run a community of residents with particular needs, the mental health and sort of behaviour, without having groups and meetings and support, has been really difficult. I think it has, without a doubt. I would say what's interesting me now is, as we're going back into hopefully expanding things and groups and community living, there's a real drive to want to make it work still. So a real sense that this is still important for us, despite being locked up for many hours a day, despite not having groups, despite not having meetings. There has been relationships have been tested. They have been tested without a doubt. The residents still want to establish that connection with each other, with the staff, with the prison. But I think it's been hard to make it work. It's required creativity, it's required perseverance. And I think, as I say, to me, what's interesting is there's a real drive and push and commitment from residents to want to get back to the way we were. So they're still engaged in us, and engaged in the prison, and engaged in wanting to be involved. But yeah, it's been a hard, bruising process, I think.
I mean, I'd echo what Richard is saying, and add that actually the ability to be creative in all kind of ways has been really, really important. I suppose that's, you know, one of the qualities of humans is that, you know, we have to reach, you know, we've all had to kind of sort of reach in ourselves and kind of pull those creative ways of thinking out of the hat, really, as we've gone along. And it has felt like, for me, it's felt like building sandcastles on a shifting sand. You know, we haven't known, I suppose it's very much a mirror of society now, isn't it? We haven't really known, you know, kind of month to month, you know, what we're up against and where the changes might come in, whether we're going to have groups again or then not groups. We've moved in and out of being able to put groups on and then withdrawing again. But the hope has remained with the residents. I mean, there will be a fallout. Obviously, there are some residents that we haven't got the time to work with now. They've lost that time. There isn't enough time to engage them, and they will go. I think we will struggle for, like lots of businesses, I think we will struggle for a while. The culture will have to be rebuilt. I think for the staffing team, it's been very difficult. I think we will have to, you know, deal with some of the fallout of that as well, in terms of rebuilding the sort of resilience in staffing teams again. I think it's, you know, it's had the ability to split and fracture, you know, very much mirroring, I suppose, societal value sort of concern, you know, in other words, how society is managing it. You know, it has felt like quite similar for Grendon. But I agree with Richard that the installation of hope has remained on the whole, and there is still a lot of energy to get back to some form of business. And I think we've been quite lucky that the residents have managed it on the whole as well as they have.
Mm-hmm. Certainly from, you know, the letters that I've been receiving, there's been obviously a kind of sense of the impact, but generally they've kind of talked about ways in which they're kind of dealing with that and trying to navigate their way through it. So yeah, I think the kind of the return to how things were has certainly been echoed in the correspondence that I've had and in the conversation I had yesterday. You know, it was yeah, it was kind of illuminating in how positive it was actually. So yeah, I guess we're all reacting, aren't we? And we take it as it comes and do our best, and that's all we can do, really, I think.
Yeah, but I think that we share that energy, Dean, in getting back to normal that maybe the residents have. You know, we're as eager with the residency to you know, go back in even stronger than we managed before the pandemic. But yeah, that brings us to exactly an hour. That was neat, okay. Dean. So yeah, I guess I just need to say thank you to both of you for joining us. I know that you're in between meetings and it's always hectic at the moment, so we really appreciate your time. And yeah, that's it then. Thanks, Dean.
I'd just like to say thank you as well for your continued support of the residency as well, because you've been great, both of you, in supporting what we're doing, and so really appreciate that. Thank you.